Everyone, welcome to this video on mechanization for novices. What I'm going to discuss is how you're going to get better at explaining why something is true with an argument. This is going to be case to people who haven't debated that much or haven't debated before, but also for people who might want to refresh a bit on how to prove that something is true. So what am I going to discuss specifically in this video? Firstly, I'm going to explain what is mechanization. Then I'm basically going to talk about what are the steps in your argument or the burdens in your argument to explain that something is true. Thirdly, I'm going to discuss how you can come up with mechs, mechs just being short for mechanizations. And lastly, I'm just going to discuss actor analysis. How are you going to explain in a debate that a specific actor will react a specific way or will act a specific way? That's what I'm going to discuss in this video. So let's just get into it. I hope you still understand or still have an idea what this visualization means. So you start with a motion and you have these steps or burdens. And what is mechanization in this context? Mechanization is just a proof that you're fulfilling a burden or that a step in your argument actually works. So it is always going to be the answer to the question, why is this true? Why is it what I'm saying true? So if you look at this visualization, if the rivers are water and rivers, then mechanizations are going to be the bridges over the river. The idea being that you go from the motion, are able to prove every burden by going over each bridge to then get to the treasure chest, which is going to be your impact. And that's basically what mechs are. So we're going to discuss these bridges in this video. Now, if I've given you this visualization, I hope that it's clear that the first thing that we need to discuss is how are you going to find those steps? Because you can ask yourself a million times, why is this true? Why is this true? Why is this true? But if you're not fulfilling all your burdens, then there are no bridges on all rivers, and therefore you're basically going to drown while going towards your impact. And that is quite sad. So what are then in general the three burdens of an argument? Firstly, the problem in the status quo. And the status quo here means the current state of affairs. How does the world look like now? It's a bit of debate lingo. Secondly, it's going to be why is the alternative that you're going to be defending better? So why is it that the either implementing a motion that the world you're going to get to is going to be better? And how is that going to actually look like? So just saying, what are the non-problems in this alternative? Lastly is why is this alternative effective? Or why is this actually going to happen? Or why is it that this will be implemented well? All these kinds of things. So to kind of come up with this, because again, this is very abstract, but you can need to do this a bit more specifically in an argument or when you're debating a specific motion. So let's just start with the first thing, a problem in the status quo. So the question that you can ask yourself is, why would a person set this motion in the first place? So try to get in the head of the person who created this motion and think, what did they intend with this motion? What did they think that we're going to discuss in the first place? This is oftentimes nice because sometimes it doesn't seem balanced, but then at the moment you're going to think, why would a person set this motion? You're going to think like, oh, maybe they actually want to discuss these clashes as well to maybe make it a bit more balanced, for example. But also, you could just ask yourself, what was recent in the news? So is there something that they're discussing here which recently had gotten into the news, or I can maybe link to what has recently gotten into the news? But sometimes there are just also general problems with something, so general issues. So if you are talking about banning zoos, for example, clearly the general problem here is going to be about animal welfare. Maybe even there's some recent thing in the news that happened where a zoo was shut down because of specific reasons, which you can also then use as to maybe think about what is the problem in the status quo, how does this look like? Secondly, the alternative. Why is it better? So what you're going to oftentimes think about is what is kind of like the root of the problem that I analyzed, the first thing, and how is this going to change? Is it going to be smaller? Is it going to be the opposite? And how is this going to look like? So you're going to discuss how will this world look like when it will have changed. Lastly, you're then going to explain why is it that you're going to get to the alternative. So will people and companies and actors buy into it? How effective is the government in the first place if you're going to discuss a motion where the government is going to implement a specific policy? You can consider things such as bureaucracy. You can think about the slowness of the government, all this kind of stuff. Now, this is still quite abstract. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a specific motion, and then I'm going to ask you to think about the burdens. So the motion is this house would legalize all drugs. And the argument that you want to go for is there are going to be less overdoses, so less people die. So I want you to pause the video right now and ask yourself the question, what are the burdens or steps in the specific context, in a specific argument? Now, I hope you have had the possibility to think about this for a second and that you have come up with your burdens. So the burdens that I see in this debate are, or specifically this argument, are threefold. Firstly, drugs are unsafe now. Two, legalizing drugs will make them safer. And thirdly, people will consume the safer drugs. So it is the status quo, we have this problem, which is the drugs are unsafe. Then the alternative will look better because the drugs will actually be safer, but also the effectiveness of the policy. People will actually consume these drugs. In a visualization, this is how it would look like. The motion, this house would legalize all drugs. The burdens, unsafe drugs right now, safer drugs later on, and also people will actually consume this safer drugs. And then the treasure chest here, of course, is less people dying, which I think is a very intuitive impact, I hope. Now, we now have considered how you come up with these burdens, but you just need to ask yourself now, how do we come up with mechanizations? So in preparation time, or in prep, as it's also called, you need to just ask yourself, why is this true? Why is this what I'm saying actually going to happen? How often do you need to ask yourself this? Really, really, really a lot. So really often you need to ask yourself these questions. And it's going to be especially a lot more than you might be comfortable with in the beginning, because you're not going to have this intuition of how much you need to prove. And I think maybe to explain why you need to ask yourself this so much is you might have specific ideas of what you're talking about. You know the examples, you know what you mean, you have this visual picture in your head. But the judge doesn't have that. But not only does the judge not have your specific train of thought, the judge also has other people who have different train of thoughts and different ideas and say different things. So now the judge needs to compare all this analysis that is basically broad, reason why something is true or is not true. And at the moment that you're just more explicit, then it is clearer that your argument is going to stand compared to someone who is less specific. And therefore, it is going to be good to just ask yourself a lot of the times, why is this true? The way to do this is during preparation time to just pretend like there is this small kid there. And I don't know if you've been around small kids, but they just ask the question, why, a gazillion times. Just think about this small kid during preparation times and explaining it to this small kid and making sure that they get what you're talking about. So ask that question as much as a 3-year-old. An alternative is just think about the judge as just being very dumb. So being devoid of any human contact with the world, has no idea what's actually happening. And that judge really needs you to explain every single thing for that person to understand why what you're saying is true. So you need to be very detailed. Both of these methods of like thinking during prep time are going to help you with asking this question enough during prep time. I want to note that if you're going to ask yourself, why is this true? This is going to create reasons, but not all reasons are the same, or not every mech is the same. So there are oftentimes two levels of mechanization. Firstly is the step level. So this basically means you have a burden. So you have a river. The reason why you're going to fill that burden, that is just going to be a step or a mech level. So that's going to be the bridge. But again, if I'm asking you to think more often, why is this true? Then if you've given a reason, you're going to ask again, but why is this reason true? And then you might give multiple reasons why the reason that you gave is true. And then you're not working anymore on the mech level, but then you're working on what is called the sub-mech level. So you give sub-mechs or sub-reasons for why what you're saying is true. So this is sometimes also what you will hear, where they're going to be like, where speakers are going to tell you, hey, I have this reason why something is true. First sub-mech, second sub-mech. And then you know that they're not talking just about this burden, but they're talking about something else to kind of like prove why the reason they gave you was already true. It's also going to be important because it gives you this overall structure for the arguments. Because if you know that this isn't working to what they were talking about before, but they were just talking about why a specific reason is true, that's going to be less confusing for you because you now know what they are referring to. Now, I basically told you to think about why a lot, but I haven't told to you yet about how many mechanizations or mechs you need to give. Overall, I would recommend 2 or 3. Why would I recommend at least 2? So at the moment you have this burden and you have 2 of these bridges. And at the moment, one person rebuts one of these bridges, so rebuts one mechanization, then at least you have one bridge standing. So you're still able to go from the motion to the impact. I would note, however, that I wouldn't go that much further than 3 or 4 mechs. The reason being quite simple. At the moment, you're going to have a lot of reasons that doesn't really speak about the quality of those reasons. So at the moment you're just going to say reason 1, reason 2, reason 3, and you don't really go into much detail, the judge doesn't really know what you're exactly going to be talking about or why what you're specifically talking about is true. If that is the case, then you're going to be less persuasive than other speakers who might go into more detail. So just think about also the quality of the things you're talking about. But let's say you're going to have like 5 really high quality mechs or reasons why something is true. It is still not going to be useful for you because you just have a time constraint. So it comes with an opportunity cost. So at the moment, you only have 5 or 7 minutes to speak. At the moment, you're going to use 4 of those minutes to just talk about why something is true. Then you're leaving out things such as rebuttal or explaining why something is true. So don't go too overboard and don't do like 4 or 5 or 6 reasons for every single thing into high level detail because you're going to get into time problems. Now, I also say that this is 2 or 3. How do you decide when it's 2 or when it's 3? That's basically going to be based on importance. So let's say you have, again, the example of legalizing drugs and you want to make it safer. I think at the moment you're going to be talking about the government making drugs safer. I think this is quite intuitive. And I don't think this needs that much argumentation or mechanization. So I think here like 2 mechs would be fine because I don't think that's going to be the most contested thing. However, drugs being unsafe in the status quo, that's going to be a bit more contested. Because if you think about it, how would you attack your own argument? Well, opposition might say, well, actually, drug dealers don't have the incentive to really use bad drugs or to create bad drugs that get overdoses because that they're killing their own consumers. And as well as they're going to be competition. So when one person has just safer drugs, then you're going to go to that drug dealer instead of you. So that's going to be contested. So if you have more reasons placed on there and you think about, the quality and you're explaining to detail why those reasons are actually going to be very true, then it is much more easier for your argument to stand and it is much less likely for just some rebuttal to take over it. Also, lastly, I want to note that at the moment you're going to be thinking of these reasons. It might be also very good to still use illustrations. So sometimes debaters can get very abstract. So they're talking about political capital, social capital, resource management, all this kind of stuff. However, it is going to be less intuitive for your argument the more abstract language you're going to use. So I would recommend using illustrative arguments. So at the moment you're talking about very strong drugs, for example, or bad drugs, then using an example of how this would look like. So for example, very strong cocaine, which then leads to an overdose, is something that's already going to make it clearer in the judge's head what exactly you're talking about, but also creates this mental picture, which means that also oftentimes immediately creates this idea that's going to be more important and sticks more of them during deliberation. So that's also just something that I want to highlight, that using illustrations and illustrative language can be very good for thinking of reasons to make them stand out and make them memorable to the judge. Now, I've given you basically the idea of what mechanizations are and how many you should do and how this kind of works, but I haven't really talked to you yet about how can you come up with mechanizations. And this is going to be quite difficult because to a certain extent, this is just something that you gain with experience. So it is very hard for me to give you like a structural way to think of why something is true because it might be different for a lot of people. And also, I don't think it would be very useful to have this strict form of this is how you come up with reasons, because every debate is different, every argument is different, and therefore it's not going to be that useful. However, what I am going to tell you is what are the questions that you can ask yourself during preparation time to come up with reasons. So here are some ways that you can get inspirations for your mechs. So oftentimes it can be quite useful to not only think about things in abstract, as I already stated, but also go into a bit more visualization. So visualize to yourself, how will this implementation look like? How will governments do this? But also like play a scenario. Let's say you are a person and you now hear that this is going to happen. How would you act? Why is this going to be the case? And then you can also, of course, talk about specific people. So you can be about, let's say how would a teacher react to this, or how would um, a a parent react to this happening? And that's going to oftentimes just give you already an idea of like, oh, this is how parents would react. But why do parents react this way? Oh, they're very protective of their children. Why are they protective of their children? And that's then how you go on and go on and go on. Now, like I also already stated, is at the moment you have an idea of what you need to prove burden wise. So you understand what you need to prove because you already have this idea of what the problem is. You can again look at the problem from like the news stories and the examples that you know from personal life and deconstruct them. So you can think, but what was the initial cause of this? How did people react to what happened? Why did people react a specific way? And at the moment you already have this information, it becomes more tangible to you and you can think of those reasons why it is true. Also, you can just look through different lenses. So already talked a bit about how different people might react, but you might just also think about actors in general. So how would companies react to this? How would cops enforce this? Or how would they feel about enforcing this? How will the news or the media react to this? How will social media react to this? How will organized crime react to this? What do they want? How are they going to use this or not use this? Lastly, note that most motions are going to be set in a context in which something can happen. So again, consider the example of this house with legalized drugs. Not only Europe and the US and Canada can, for example, legalize drugs. This can also happen in other countries, such as maybe Asian countries or African countries. But because these are different countries with different political systems, cultural context, all this kind of stuff, then the legalization of drugs has a very different meaning than how we would do this, for example, in the West. So maybe considering different contexts already gives you an idea of why something is important, why something is true. So thinking about this in different contexts is going to be quite useful because it also might be something that you can use to outframe other teams. What do I mean with that? Let's say you're talking about, yes, it's very nice that in the West it's going to happen, but in Africa, this would happen in this way overall, which is going to be more important because more people live in Africa, for example. Or you can think of more structural reasons. So say these reasons only work in the West. We give reasons that actually work also in developing nations or in, the other groups in the world. So those are kind of like ways that you can think of mechanizations, but also think about unique mechanizations compared to other teams. This was still quite abstract. So let's just consider the same example as we had before. So we have the motion, this house would legalize all drugs. And you still have the same argument, which is going to be about there are going to be less overdoses. Consider the step or the burden, which is going to be drugs are unsafe right now. I want you to pause the video and to think about the reasons why drugs are unsafe now. So I hope that in the meantime, you've been able to think of some reasons why drugs are unsafe. Let's discuss what I personally have thought of. So I want to note there are no right or wrong answers here because every person has just different intuitions and different reasons can be equally good reasons. I'm just going to discuss the things that I have thought of, and these are just the things that came intuitively to my mind. Your answers most likely will differ to this. So let's just discuss the 3 points. Firstly, people who are making drugs don't have access to good chemicals. So why is this true? well, a sub reason for this or a sub mech for this would be that oftentimes if you just buy large quantities, it's going to be super sus, and then the police is just going to follow you, and then they know that you're making drugs. Or there are just limits on how much an individual can buy drugs, or you need to have a certificate that you're from a specific company that needs discount calls, all this kind of stuff. Secondly, at the moment you're going to have drugs and you're going to sell them illegally, you need to smuggle them because the police can't just know that you're carrying drugs in a very big pickup truck. That means that you're going to oftentimes need to make stronger drugs because those are easier to hide in, for example, in wheels or in shoes. And the problem there, of course, being that if you have stronger drugs, it's easier to take an overdose. And I think this is also an example of how you can make it visual. So it's not just in abstract, you need stronger drugs, and therefore you're going to, because that's easy for smuggling, it also shows you how are you going to smuggle this? And then how is people going to die? Well, it's just easier for them to accidentally take a bit too much coke and then they die because the coke was just too strong. And again, you can also do this with the last reason being just labs are not sanitized. And here I have just explicitly written down the submechs. The submechs here is, firstly, no one is checking them. There's just no regulation from the government of how these labs should look like. But also, they just need to move quickly oftentimes to prevent cops from finding them, or they need to hide the stuff, which means they often don't have the time to really sanitize all the things and to make sure that everything has high quality. And oftentimes this also just happens in sheds. So already this is not really a good way to make drugs in the first place. So this is kind of like a way that you can go about mechanization. And I hope this already becomes clear how deep you should go, right? Because I'm asking myself, even when I'm telling you these reasons, why is it true that you don't have access to good chemicals? And then I just give more reasons for why that's the case. So this is what I mean with sub-mechanization. Sometimes you can actually highlight the sub-mechanization, as I did with my labs are sanitized, but sometimes you don't really need to, because if it already just flows well and it is intuitive that you're talking about different things, then you don't need to go like 1A, 1B, 1C, which actually might take more time and might make it a bit more robotic, and therefore maybe less persuasive than just letting something flow naturally. However, sometimes you might have a lot of reasons. And if you have a lot of reasons and sub reasons, then numbering them might be nice because then you at least know if you're now giving a sub reason or a reason in general. I would just recommend experiment something, ask the judge if it was clear, and then try something new the next debate. Now, let's just go into the last point, which is actor analysis. So at the moment that somebody tries to explain how an actor will behave if a specific motion is going to happen, then you need to prove two things. Firstly, what is the motivation of the actor? Secondly, what is the capacity or the possibility that this actor has? So for the first question about motivation, you need to ask yourself, what does the actor want? What do they value? And why is that the case? But you might also discuss this not only from an intrinsic want, but you can also just discuss what are the pressure that this actor experience. So, for example, teenagers might want to express themselves, but they also feel a lot of pressure to fit in, and therefore there might be a difference from what they want to what they actually are going to, want more, which is, wanting to be in a group and have a form of belonging. You can also just ask what are their kind of like primary needs, in the sense that what do they really need to survive? So for humans, this is quite intuitive, right? So they need somewhere to stay, somewhere that isn't too hot or too cold, food, drinks, and all this kind of stuff. However, for companies, this might be different, right? So for companies, what they need is money, but they also need to have products, or they need to have a workforce, all this kind of stuff. And if you understand what the primary needs are, they can also just explain what is the biggest motivation. Because again, people and actors are in general complex, but if you just know what they need to subsist in the first place, then that motivation is oftentimes stronger than something that is secondary, which is what would they want or how would they want to self-actualize. Secondly, also you need to consider the capacity of the individual. So let's say you have now highlighted an individual wants to express themselves, so a teenager wants to express themselves. Are they able to? Can they do it? What are the venues for them to do this? do they have, for example, the money to buy their own clothes, or are their parents too strict and still buying them clothes? All this kind of stuff. But also, do they even know what the possibilities are? So let's say you are a person who wants to express yourself as a teenager, but I don't know, you've never seen somebody dye their hair. Then you do not know that that really is an option because you've never seen that happen. So this is also just about information and what can a person know. Sometimes this is in debating is the fancy word called like epistemic access because you cannot know that like colored hair exists, so you don't have epistemic, which refers to knowledge or just in general knowledge, and access, so you cannot access it, so you don't know it. Um, this is just debate lingo, which is comes from philosophy. It's kind of just bullshit. It basically just means people do not know what they know. So again, if you hear this in debates, what they're basically talking about is a person cannot know this. Um, Again, it's important to actually know this debate lingo sometimes because you can just get flabbergasted at what people are even talking about. So this analysis of what the motivation is and the capacity is of individuals is oftentimes also called characterization or framing. Sometimes people place it before or after an argument, and therefore they do that because at the moment they have this characterization, it's going to be easy for them to just, call up these reasons. Some people just, when they are talking about a specific burden, are going to use characterization or framing. This is something to maybe look out for if you hear it in speech, because if you do not know that this is what it is and what it might do, then you might not react to the full brunt of the argument. So let's again just do an exercise. So we have, again, the same motion. This house would legalize all drugs. We have the same argument. There are going to be less overdoses. And then the step that you want to prove is that people will use safe drugs, because this is just analyzing how will an actor behave. So I want you to now pause the video and think about, why do people consume legal drugs? Okay, I hope you've taken enough time to think of this. There are two bridges in this, which I think link to two things: motivation and capacity. So I have thought of some basic things. Um, First thing, what you can do is motivation. So you can just say people just don't want to go to jail, or don't want to get punished or a criminal record. Is this true? At the moment, they're going to go to jail. There are just bad things happening. There are oftentimes gangs, but also this is going to screw up your chance of getting a job later, which is bad because people want security, and it's more difficult to get when they are going to, have a criminal record. But also, particularly, people want info on the drugs that they're taking. Why is it true? Intuitively, you're putting something in your mouth which has been shown in media to actually have some possible negative side effects, or you have heard of people dying of it. So people just want to have this information, and therefore they're going to go to legal drugs because legal drugs most likely have some information or some legislation about the information that they need to give about it. So the capacity, I think capacity in this specific context isn't that big of an issue. So I think overall it is more intuitive to, for example, spend more time explaining the motivation. But overall, you do need to prove both motivation and capacity. So, let's say you hear, for example, a person talk about, here are all the reasons why a person wants to do this, and you need to rebut that speech. You can be like, either let me rebut all the points that they're talking about motivation, which might take a long time, or you can be like, well, they talk about motivation, but do they ever prove capacity? No, they don't. Let me give reasons why people don't have the capacity. And that is a good way to maybe deal with rebuttal. But if that's a good way to deal with rebuttal and you're making your own case, you want this rebuttal to not be effective. So you want to also focus at least a bit on capacity. So I think it is very intuitive that you're basically going to know about this option, because you're going to say, and like schools, like as part of a model, in schools, most likely you're going to have information programs about the drugs, and it's going to be clear that there are just shops in your city in which you can just buy legal drugs, like you see them when you walk by. But also, this is maybe something that becomes a um, bit more controversial in debate, I would say, which is just the money argument. So people can just afford it. So an argument the other side might say that cheaper, like illegal drugs are just cheaper, and therefore they're going to use them. Or at the moment you're going to have taxes and a shop and all this kind of stuff. There are extra things that you need to take into account, which lead to a higher price. You can say, well, yeah, we have all this motivation for them to do illegal drugs. The question is not whether it is cheaper. The question is, do they have the capacity to actually afford this, and then you can give some reasons here. So you could be like, drugs are not going to be super expensive because you're going to have multiple drug companies and stores, which means you're going to have competition, which is going to drive them down. But also, the government has the incentive to make sure that the drugs aren't too expensive. So people who do the illegal drugs, so they're going to be price caps or all this kind of stuff. But also, you can just frame this and be like, hey, we see, for example, in Portugal and the Netherlands, if you go to get drugs, then we see that it's actually not that expensive. If you look for example, like a weed shop or whatever. So in general, you can also just use these intuitions. Again, I would like to highlight that in this specific case, you also need to ask yourself, what do I need to prove more? Here is more intuitive that you need to do motivation more, and capacity you can do maybe as an afterthought, or you can maybe just work on it. So it's going to be a bit more difficult to rebut it that way. Now, this is basically all the things I want to discuss. So what are going to happen? Next video, I'm going to go to the treasure chest instead of the rivers. So I'm going to talk about impacting. Why is it that, something is important, and how do you prove that and place it in debate? I hope you had fun with this. I hope that everything was clear. If you just have some questions or you want to know something more, just put it in the comments and I'll check those out. And then hopefully see you the next video. Bye.